Hello, and welcome to this first presentation of 3 exciting days. I'm very thrilled to be able to open this session. My name is Niels Ejskjaer, and I'm a clinical professor of diabetes with a great interest in neuropathy and the diabetic foot. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So this is a challenging field, I must say, and I'd like to start saying that the challenges facing the epidemiology of the neuropathic diabetic foot are exactly the same challenges that we face in clinical neuropathy and clinical and research neuropathy in the diabetic foot. So an agenda, this is only 10 minutes. We need to be sharp on time. Diabetes in numbers, neuropathy in numbers, some landmark studies that I pulled out for you, especially today. And we are going into what is the problem with the epidemiology and neuropathy and a short summary. So I think the background numbers speak for themselves, and you're going to hear this a number of times during these 3 days. The expected population with diabetes in 2045, 690 million people. Healthcare costs in the US exceeding 106 billion US dollars. And what's even more interesting, up to 40% spent in relation to the diabetic foot alone. And you know, neuropathy is really the causative agent of all, for a great number of problems with the diabetic foot. So I'm not going into the clinical presentations of diabetes. This is the first presentation. You haven't heard that much of it, although I'm sure most of you already are well into it. So diabetic peripheral neuropathy really is the main risk factor for foot ulcers and amputations and you know, painful neuropathy as well, and a number of other neuropathy related conditions. It's associated with significant morbidity and mortality. You're going to hear about that in detail. It impairs quality of life greatly for the individual. So I'm going to mention briefly the clinical impact of neuropathy and diabetes. So you know, 8.3% of the population in the US has diabetes type 1 and most of them type 2. 60% with type 2 diabetes will develop neuropathy. We're going into these numbers in greater detail shortly. 25% with type 2 diabetes, according to a study in 2005, will develop a foot ulcer. 83% of all major amputations are due to diabetes. 11% cumulative risk of a major amputation after 25 years have you developed neuropathy. So this sort of underlines the last few slides how important neuropathy is and how important the diabetic foot, including ulcers and amputations, how challenging they really are to the healthcare systems. So here's one study just to open it up. Cross-sectional studies from US and Europe. Prevalence of diabetic peripheral neuropathy ranging from 6.1% to 51%. So I could just start out now saying, choose what prevalence rate you prefer, but it's a little more intriguing and complicated than that. References for these studies stated. So starting out early, there's a landmark French historical cohort study from 1947, not translated in French. 4,400 adults with diabetes followed from 47 to 73, and 50% developed peripheral neuropathy at 25 years of follow-up. It's a massive study and has not been undertaking any of its kind since then, and perhaps this is just what we need. We're not going into details about the parameters and the investigations studied at that time. It may have been more or less clinical observations, most of it. So another important study, the DDCT ethics studies, and it tells us that the duration of diabetes is important. At baseline, 6% suffered diabetic or had clinical significant diabetic peripheral neuropathy, while it came to 30% after 13 to 14 years of follow-up. And when you look into diabetes in the young, and if you search for neuropathy in the young, Ejskjaer and Eva Feldman and others heading the search for diabetes in the young study group studied 329 people, young people with type 1, 70 young people with type 2 diabetes, and found the prevalence rates stated here for type 1, 8.2%, and, you know, somewhat surprising, 25.7% neuropathy in type 2 diabetes. So the prevalence in type 2 diabetes, young people, are near to adult populations. So what I've told you on this far is that this is just a, you know, a fragmented picture we're looking at, and it's difficult to make all ends meet. Well, let's continue and see what's up next. So I think this is a nice study. It's community-based, it's huge. Abbott, Bolton, others from the UK looked at an astonishing number of patients, more than 15,000, and found that 49% had signs of clinical neuropathy, loss, pinprick, vibration, temperature, well selected parameters, of course, and an astonishing, a somewhat high prevalence of painful neuropathy, up to 21%. So varying numbers this far. Escalates with duration of diabetes, found in the young also, and about 50-60% after 30 years of diabetes duration. So another huge study, 118 hospital diabetes clinics, also from the UK, 6,487 adult persons with diabetes, of whom 37% had type 1 diabetes. That's the problem with hospital-based investigations, because they are there's a preponderance of type 1 diabetes in the hospital population, whereas type 2 is more, you know, restricted to primary healthcare sectors. So prevalence 23% type 1, 32% type 2, and increasing with age. Again, the duration of diabetes, 5% 18 to 29 years, and 44% 70 to 79 years. And these are, of course, rough measures from this huge study. And present in more than 50% aged over 60 years of age. Very round numbers. You're welcome to look into the studies in great detail. I did not take all the graphs in here. I thought I'd not tire you with all the p-values and 4 or 6 diagrams on each slide, but more give you an idea of what this is all about and where I suggest the challenges are in this field. And we'll come back to that later. So I think one of the more beautiful studies, the Rochester Diabetic Neuropathy Study, published in 1993, 380 persons with diabetes from Rochester, Minnesota, and they were able to, in this relatively smaller number of patients, to go into greater detail with Peter James Dick and his peripheral team at the Mayo Clinic. 50% distal symmetrical polyneuropathy at follow-up, 22% asymptomatic carpal tunnel syndrome, and neuropathy symptoms, as you can read it, and they looked into autonomic neuropathy also. So also doing peripheral neuropathy studies, we mainly look at large fiber neuropathies, and the small fiber neuropathies are underrepresented, especially when it comes to peripheral neuropathy. Also, we'll come back to that in greater detail. Mononeuropathies, and here it's stated 10% actually had diabetes, had neuropathy, not due to diabetes. Similar numbers have come from the UK earlier, and it could be up to 15%, 18% other causes of neuropathy than diabetes, and that's a huge list of other possible causes. So this is sort of a run through of the Rochester Diabetic Neuropathy Study, the St. Louis Valley's diabetes study, and the Pittsburgh Epidemiology of Diabetes Complication Study. Also, the last study here is a landmark study, and the prevalences, as you can see on the right-hand side, about 45-50%, 25.8%, 34%. But if you look into it, as I would advise anybody interested in epidemiological studies, particularly so in peripheral neuropathy, the diabetic peripheral neuropathy left-hand corner It's diagnosed here with the Rochester study, positive symptoms and nerve conduction studies. The second study on neurological exams mainly, and the third study in the presence of 2 of 3 abnormal sensory or motor signs, symptoms, or decreased tendon reflexes. So the basis of the epidemiological studies is really, really important. And it may not reflect your standard person with diabetes in your clinic. So you really have to be careful also. So I'd say that if we are to look into factors that affect the quality of prevalence data, I think the variation in diagnostic criteria is really important here. So we do have criteria to diagnose peripheral neuropathy, vibration perception threshold at 25 volts. Nice paper from the mid-90s. We're still relying on this. We haven't moved far forward that swiftly since then when it comes to bedside testing. And how about the type of diabetes? So is it really type 1 or type 2? Undetected type 2 diabetes is not included here. So I think type 2 diabetes has been a long-standing duration, a great number of people with type 2 diabetes at the diagnosis. So it really is a confounder. As I mentioned, I believe the large fiber endpoints are overrepresented. And many people believe now that small fibers are earlier affected than large fibers, and we're not really looking for them to a great extent. No robust clinical endpoints. And this is what I alluded to in the beginning of this presentation, that the problems facing epidemiology are more or less the same problems facing clinical and research issues regarding the diabetic neuropathic foot. So we cannot really measure accurately enough, and this greatly hampers research. And I must say it also hampers clinical practice. There's a lack of correct diagnostic coding. That is we may see patients, people with diabetes, people with a diabetic foot in the clinic, but they're perhaps not at all times coded correctly in the primary sector and in secondary sectors. Most data are from the hospital registries or surveys. Bolton and Abbott, they showed us a huge population-based study, but there are not a great many of them. And I think we need reliable population-based prospective studies. But it makes no sense to perform them unless we do better with the inclusion criteria, diagnostic criteria, if we not do any better with the clinical endpoints. So we really need to step up and step forward. The ideal situation would be if we could rely on real-world data only, but this is perhaps something for the future that would reflect the populations in a more correct way. So I think in closing up this presentation, I think in summary, I would advise everybody, including myself, to scrutinize all epidemiological neuropathy studies really carefully and to examine the assumptions. It relies on a lot of assumptions, parameters, clinical endpoints, demographics, types of diabetes, all you can think of, and the interpretations of it all, to examine all of this carefully. And I think summing it all up, clinically, overall, you can expect 50% peripheral neuropathy at 25 years of diabetes duration overall in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And then how about other types of diabetes? MODY, LADA, 3C, and so on, not covered. And there's an association which is clear with the duration of diabetes, glycemic control, and a number of risk factors identified. But we need to be certain that we really report these correctly when doing the epidemiological studies. And of course, as you know it from the clinical daily life, individual neuropathy patterns really are very common. Not two persons with diabetic neuropathy are the same, not two persons with a diabetic foot are the same at all. So I think I'll just say thank you very much for your attention. And I really would have liked to discuss this in further detail, and I'm quite sure I've perhaps stirred up some questions, but hope to see you at some time, and we'll be able to answer those questions. Thank you very much. Enjoy the meeting.